So hello and welcome thanks for joining us for our seminar this evening called Give, Get or Get Off, Are We Underutilising Our Arts Boards? My name is Morwenna Collett and I'm the Deputy Chair of the SAMAG Committee. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I'd also like you to consider joining in the conversation tonight at any point that you like via Twitter. Our handle is #SamagSid. And it's a real pleasure to have joining us this evening such a knowledgeable and quite a large panel, I have to say too, who are looking very, very good on the floor and up there. So before I hand over to our chair to do the job of introducing them to you all, I'd first like to introduce you to our wonderful chair this evening, Anne-Maria Nicholson, who is a Sydney-based author, journalist and media trainer with broad experience in the arts. She's the author of 3 novels, the first of which has set her in her homeland of New Zealand, where it topped the fiction list. She served as a board member and deputy chair of the Australian Society of Authors, and she's been involved in the continuing fight for writers' copyright. Anne-Maria has also been a news and current affairs journalist in the ABC, where she was the national arts reporter covering all art forms and also the politics of arts funding. She also reported for Foreign Correspondent, Lateline and 7:30 Report in Australia and internationally, and was awarded a Getty Fellowship for Arts Reporting, which was based in Los Angeles. She is a former councillor of Manly Council and was part of a reform team that changed environmental planning and cultural decision-making in Sydney's Northern Beaches. She was also president of the Manly Art Gallery and Museum Society and has continued a strong involvement with that gallery. So please join with me in welcoming Anne-Maria to get the evening underway.
Thank you very much. I just want to double check that we're picking up all right from here, are we? We didn't do a sound check, so okay. Welcome everybody to this Monday night, and thank you to everybody for coming out. I flew in today from the Byron Bay Writers' Festival, where I saw that board members of an organisation have to sometimes work above and beyond what they might have signed on for. The major marquee flew down in 80-kilometre winds on Wednesday night. The site was almost destroyed. Board members were seen shovelling mud and wood chips and whatever it took to get that major event back on track. So it's the way it is in the arts, and it turned out to be a triumph with goodwill prevailing through stormy winds and rains as we all dashed between marquee to marquee. So I just wanted to do a bit of a scene setter that if you sign on for an arts board, you may get more than you expected. So tonight's, the theme of tonight is Give, Get or Get Off. Are we underutilising our arts boards? Now, as many of you know, I'm sure a lot of, certainly all the panel have been involved with arts boards, and I'm sure a number of the audience have as well, that being part of a board is a pleasure, but it's also a responsibility. And in these straitened times, often a fight for the survival of the company you have tied yourself to. And the pleasure, of course, comes from associating with an arts organisation or individual whose work you admire and enjoy, and helping to sustain and develop that work. The responsibility comes from meeting legal compliance requirements and ensuring that organisational performance meets the expectations of the public and key holders. Now, increasingly, it also means fundraising, and there seems to be an expectation in Australia that if you join an arts board, you may well be expected to personally put your hand in your pocket, as is the norm, I think, in the United States and many other companies. So what does that mean, though, for artists usually equal poor, and that would be beyond any expectation that an artistic practitioner would or could be able to do the same. And so this, of course, creates a huge dilemma. If people like bankers, corporate lawyers, media and IT and casino tycoons and heirs to fortune are the rich ones, does that mean that if boards become dominated by people with the dosh, rather than the artistic talent. Is that a problem or not? Now, in Australia, of course, our situation has been complicated because the coalition government, both under Tony Abbott and under Malcolm Turnbull, has seen fit to strip and then keep stripped the arts budget from public life in a way that has not been seen, and has shocked and really disappointed people in the cultural and intellectual side of Australian life. So that means, of course, that there were 65 organisations who've lost their funding, and another 100 which applied for grants didn't get anything. So that again puts even more pressure on arts boards. So these are some of the issues that our board, our panel tonight are going to address. So let me introduce them to you. So we'll start with Lee Lewis down the end here. And Lee is the Artistic Director of the Griffin Theatre. For theatre goers, she's well known. She has directed with great accomplishment for most of the major theatre companies in Australia. And I guess she also has to spend a lot of time reporting to the board and putting her vision. So she will have an intimate view of what that is like. Next to her is Phil Butler, who is in the not-for-profit sector leader for the Australian Institute of Company Directors. And he also, for 7 years, was on the board of the Canberra International Music Festival. And I guess he, more than anyone here tonight, is a great expert on what it means, what governance means, and what is required, and what are the responsibilities of board members. Next to me is Sophie McCarthy, who I have to admit I've met when she was 14, which is a wee while ago.
Just last week.
When I worked for the Bicentennial Authority. And Wendy McCarthy was the head of communications, and a woman with a great sense of public responsibility, and Sophie is very much in that, formed, I think, by that. And Sophie, until very recently, was a board member for Griffin Theatre for, I think, 7 years. Yeah. And she also is the executive director of McCarthy Mentoring, which is a Sydney-based consulting firm, and also with a lot of reference to art and cultural companies. And then we have Andrew Symes here, who is the chairman of PACT, Centre for Emerging Artists, and also a corporate lawyer for Challenger Limited. And I'm sure he can offer some good perspectives from both sides of the fence there. And then over here we have Kath Melbourne, who's the executive producer and CEO for Legs on the Wall, and has been in that role for some time, and is also somebody who's very familiar with the machinations of arts boards. Yes. So please welcome all of our panellists. I'd like to ask, by saying each of you to maybe talk for a minute or so on why you are where you are, what drew you in to the arts, and I think that if we could start with you.
Sure. I was a young girl in regional New South Wales, and I was one of those kids that was called the arty farties. And because art really, and theatre in particular, and visual arts, was a way of expression, finding your way through the world, a way of, making all those teen angst stuff, make bearable. And that took me to Newtown Performing Arts. And I kind of made the decision there that this was the life that I wanted to lead. I wanted a life in the arts, and that's taken me in so many different directions, from funding policy to being a flaming whipcracker in circus life, to leading a physical theatre company. And it is just the power of theatre in particular to tell stories, to engage people and to lift them out of their everyday life and get them to feel, is an incredible privilege to be part of.
Thank you. And Andrew Symes, what attracts you to the arts? What brought you and kept you there?
I had a mother that had far too much fascination and passion for singing more than anything else, and so I had no choice but to sing in long car trips to Bathurst and Orange and not get away from her. And as a result, I ended up doing a lot of music as a young child, and then getting a scholarship to a overly privileged school, which I won't mention. And from there, sort of kept doing everything around arts and theatre and a lot of different instruments and so on. And when I was in year 12, sorry to diverge, but I got all my teeth knocked out and I could barely speak, let alone sing. So I went on to study law. And after a while I got back into arts and did a bit more theatre and met a lot more people that I actually related to and loved hanging out with and loved creating artworks and performance. The long and short of it is that I got back into doing a lot of performing arts and also carried out a career in law, and those two worlds weren't meeting. So eventually one of my theatre friends was a company manager for PACT and said, why don't you come to the good side and start to help out for a little while? And that's how I got involved in the board there about 7 years ago.
I have to ask you how you got your teeth.
Golf.
Golf. I was thinking rugby.
Yeah. So that's right. I played rugby for about 15, 16 years, but it's golf that knocked my teeth out. There was a bit of a tragedy at the time.
Okay. And Sophie McCarthy.
I guess as a young person, I did grow up in a family where we went to a lot of arts and culture, Sydney symphonies, ballets, circuses, theatre. So I guess I just thought that was a normal part of life. But my early career was as a researcher. I worked in museums and then I worked in the health area. And I think if you work in those two sectors in your 20s, then I worked in overseas aid in my sort of health hat, that you learn to use resources well. You learn how to find them, you learn how to advocate to get them, and then you learn to use them very, very carefully and report on them well. So probably in my 30s I worked more in the private sector, and now I run my own business. And we do a lot of work within those sorts of cultural institutions and have worked with a lot of major performing arts companies, helping them find mentors for people. But I guess I was asked to go on the Griffin board by a colleague who saw me raising money for a local school and said, could you come and do that for us? Because we need money. So really that's how I came to my board role at Griffin. I've done it for health organisations, but that was my first role in the arts.
And Phil Butler.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll reflect on both my day role and also some time I had on the Canberra International Music Festival. My day role is not-for-profit sector leader with AICD, and I spend a lot of time talking to boards and individuals about the governance of their not-for-profit organisation. And I must admit, one of the great challenges is how diverse the not-for-profit sector is in terms of size, scope, incorporation, but indeed its overarching purpose. And I think I find that just so fascinating, dealing with both the challenges and the wonderful things that people are doing in governing those organisations. I was asked to join the music festival board by a business person who was about to leave town, and I think he said that he needed a replacement to join that board. I didn't have the artistic insights whatsoever. At that point, in fact, it was called the Chamber Music Festival, and at my second meeting I was game enough to pipe up and said, what is this chamber music stuff we're talking about anyway? Now, you could see those across the board with scowls and daggers pointed at me for asking such a question. But I'm happy to say that it did lead to a conversation much later on of, in fact, should we be changing the name of our organisation for its better purpose.
Thank you. And Lee Lewis.
I'm lucky. I found the thing I wanted to do when I was 3, and my ambition within that has just got bigger and bigger. From starting as an actor, evolving into a director, it took me around the world and made me realise that I was doing the very thing I wanted to do, which was change the imagination of the country.
Thank you. Easy. So I would like to throw open a question that you can. I'll direct it initially, but you can all buy in on. And I just wonder if I guess it is the essence. Is, do you think it is necessary to have professional expertise on an arts board? There's been a lot of debate, and I'll quote from some of that recently, about some practitioners in the arts believe not that arts boards should be run by artists. But should we have an accountant, a lawyer, a financial expert. And I'll start with Kath Melbourne.
Look, I think that the expectations that artists can and should be everything is unrealistic. I think that it's also not necessarily just about the job titles of the people that you put on the board, but the people they are. Yeah, sure, you can have an accountant on your board, but it doesn't mean that they're going to understand an arts financial environment. You know, you can have a lawyer on the board, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be supportive of the artistic vision. So for me, I can understand the symbolism of the suits versus the artist's business, but I think it's more complex and nuanced than a versus. And I think that everybody has skills that they can bring to the table. It's about the mix, it's about the human beings, and it's about the give and take in the room. For me.
And Andrew, you've had a foot in both worlds. Do you, as a corporate lawyer, being involved with a company, ever feel any resentment that you're from the big end of town?
No, not at all. I actually engaged in the board initially with a little bit of a backward step to sort of say, well, I don't know as much about you guys as I need to know to have a bigger input and a bigger position on the key issues touching the organisation strategically as well as operationally. And I quickly found out that I knew less than I thought I knew. So it was important for me in my role in that initial phase was to say, well, listen, can you take some responsibility on legal and compliance and governance? It was important for me to really step back from the artistic side of it, to listen to what the artistic vision of the organisation was and what the artistic director wanted to do, and try to play a role in terms of navigating the company along that path. Now, with that in mind, I think it actually is really important to have that diversity across different professions that we have, generally speaking, across boards in organisations in Australia. But it doesn't mean that if you don't have someone who's an accountant or any other profession, that you're going to suffer for it. It just means that you need to make sure that someone on the board there understands the issues that are important from a legislative perspective, but also as much as a company perspective and how it ties into how they can achieve their goals.
Now, in a rather notorious speech, Ralph Myers, who was the artistic director of Belvoir, put it out there that Australia's cultural life's under threat from arts leaders who are not practising artists and boards packed with businessmen. This was in the Philip Parsons Memorial Lecture in 2014, before those major cuts from the Australian Council. And he said that a cursory look at the boards of the 28 major performing arts companies reveal a shocking lack of diversity. Wealthy white men overwhelmingly dominate, followed at some distance by wealthy white women. And Lee Lewis, I don't know whether you had some sympathy for that and whether there might have been a bit of a toning down since the money sort of dried up, but what's your reaction to that?
I take the point about racial diversity, no question, but I think that's a question across all industries in Australia. I just think he was wrong, and I think to put it bluntly, I think that I think he was setting up a polemic for the sake of media reaction at that particular point, and I think it's wasted a lot of people's time, because I think most of the artists that I know working in different companies have quite very creative and fruitful relationships with their boards, and I think the boards have been evolving over the last 10-15 years in fascinating ways, and I thought that was a step backwards in the conversation for the sake of a bit of press, honestly.
Have you as an artistic director ever found you felt compromised that your artistic vision is being altered by people on boards who may not have...
No, never. I've been challenged and questioned by very smart people I've been lucky to be in a room with, and on one level I look at the board as your first audience for an idea, and people with a vested interest in having those ideas succeed. And I think that vested interest in success is something that's been developed by the whole country in the last 20 years. I think 20 years ago you would have looked at a lot of companies losing a lot of money and doing it badly. And I don't think that's the same question, which is why we've got organisations that are far more sustainable than they were, far more responsible, transparent, and evolving in those directions even more so. So I find the board's actually one of the great hopeful layers of the companies, insofar as we're now at a point where we're starting to look at the shape of those boards and what they can do, and ambitions of boards relative to the companies. I think there's some very interesting people starting to go into the idea of a board and what they can bring to a company conversation.
What was your experience, Sophie McCarthy, in that? I mean, you were in the same
I'm with
company.
her.
You were with her. But would you, if Lee Lewis or Sam Strong had come up with ideas that you just thought were financially viable and you're sitting on the board, would you try and deter them from that path?
I think your role as a board member fundamentally is to ensure that that company is viable and sustainable, like Lee said. And the pointy end of that is to hire the best people. Hire and fire the AD and the GM and the CEO. That's the pointy end of your role, and to make sure that you can support those people and their vision. And you'd want that to be a shared vision, and I guess it was. In my experience, I don't think we ever saw our role particularly, yes, to challenge and ask questions, but fortunately they came up with some pretty fabulous ideas. I mean, I haven't been in that situation where I think, well, look, maybe sometimes you see a play and you think, gee, that really wasn't the best, or we could do better, but that's really not your role at that stage.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that is, I mean, going back to Ralph's point, I just don't think that was, I don't think that happens that often. And I think if it does, then probably the board members don't really understand their role, and there probably isn't the right sort of working relationship.
Or
between
the
those
artistic
groups.
idea put forward hasn't been clarified enough to convince people. That's part of the job too.
Yeah, but that should be a conversation. I mean, that is a conversation. And if something's put up that people just, well, that's not going to sell, or no one's going to go to that, or, I mean, you'd like to think there's more development and conversation at that before it actually hits the board meeting. And I think in our experience there was.
So, Kath Melbourne, have you ever had your greatest idea knocked back because of board disagreement?
Not because of a board disagreement, because of funder maybe, but no. Generally, I'm with Lee. It's a robust conversation sometimes, and sometimes you start here, and before you get to the board, sometimes you knock your own ideas off and go, wow, what was I thinking there? I maybe had a few too many glasses of red. But generally speaking, like, there was one work that the board backed me on, which is actually about Indigenous youth suicide, and the first point of call, man, they drilled me about, where was my... I've got two board members in the room, so forgive me if I you talk about you, not individually in name, but...
Who was I talking about?
Look, no way there. They were, what effect is this going to have? How are you going to handle with audiences? Who are you going to partner with? Who are you going to make sure this is culturally right? But I also had the right people in the room to be asking that. I had Kirk Page in the room from an artistic point of view. I had Janice from a point of view who understands, the youth suicide point of view. Somebody else up there who's here, which I'm not mentioning her name, understood from a legal point of view. And they asked me, they drilled me, and I felt like the Spanish Inquisition, but we got through to the other end because I'd actually thought about those things too. Yeah. Sorry, did you want a disaster story?
Yes.
Sorry.
Just, we talked about Ralph Miles, which was a while ago, but only last month. A lot of his sentiments were repeated by Ben Eltham, who is a writer, and he's written an essay for Currency Press called When the Goalposts Move, which a lot of it was about the stripping of arts funding and the silence that came from the board members of the Australian Council, who have subsequently said they're bound by their duties and they're not allowed to speak out publicly. But he also talked about the increasing presence of business people on arts board at the expense of artists, and he said, for instance, no one seems to think it's a problem that the chairman of the Sydney Theatre Company is Ian Narev, the CEO of a major bank. What does a banker know about theatre? In the neoliberal world, business know-how is transferable to any cultural endeavour, but would an actor ever be appointed chair of the Commonwealth Bank? So, Phil Butler, you probably know full well the answer to some of that, but I'd like you to canvass some of those sentiments, and is that completely misguided?
Sure, it's a really interesting one, and I'd like to think that those couple of quotes perhaps were deliberately done just to generate some debate around this role of boards and the need for diversity of boards. Now, my take is whether it's not-for-profit or private sectors, you need diversity of boards, you need diverse skills, you need diverse minds, you need diverse cultures, and you need diverse genders, because it's about being able to bring that group of people together to help achieve the outcomes for the organisation. So whether or not they're drilling the artistic director on his or her vision for the next big thing, or whether they're drilling the executive in a private sector organisation who is passionate about a new widget or a new piece of IT, it's very similar to be able to get that different sense of view, to be able to talk about it in a collegiate manner. And that doesn't mean you need to have the place full of accountants like me, or indeed lawyers or otherwise. It is about that diversity of experience, views and perspectives that a good board can bring together.
You probably do have disaster stories about boards that don't have enough expertise on them. Can you put your finger on what goes wrong if you don't have proper governance?
There's lots of disaster stories, which I'll probably won't go into huge amounts of detail of, but suffice to say that a board is a bit like any other work group. So you've actually got to build up that level of comfort and trust within the board. You know, I can think back to my times on the arts board, a bit like the storm at Byron Bay, of doing all sorts of odd things as a volunteer. But I understood at that point I was actually acting as a volunteer. I wasn't acting as a board member, so my skill wasn't at that point being used to govern the organisation. It was actually me just helping out in a specific area. And I think that's a really critical thing for boards to be able to do, to understand that difference. So you don't, in an artistic sense, you don't want a board to be really trying to drive the operations of the organisation, or trying to second guess what's going to be the winning formula in an artistic sense. What you need the board to be able to do is have those really good and robust conversations, and then feel comfortable in the decision that you end up making. Again, from a business perspective, I think one of my more challenging conversations at my board was around, well, how are we going to run this festival if we don't have one or two big ticket items? Because I could see it running off the rails if we didn't have a couple of those blockbusters. And they were hard conversations to have around the board table.
Mm. Sophie McCarthy, we talk about who's suitable, but on the other hand, the other side of this equation is why do it? Because people are busy, it probably takes a lot of sacrifice, people have other jobs, and usually it's on an honorary position, juggling families and stuff. Why do it in the first place? What keeps someone there?
I think, well, the best board is one that's fun, where you believe in what the organisation does, and that was an absolute pleasure at Griffin. It was a small, I think there was 7 staff, a couple more now.
No, we're only up to 8.
So, it's a small, lean team, and people believe in storytelling and writing Australian plays and producing those and telling Australian stories, and that is something that definitely resonates with me, with my family, and I think with most Australians. And it was about working with some super clever people at the board and in the organisation that have been around 30 years, and to work in a director's hat, like Phil was saying. It's very easy in a place that's tiny for you to wear a lot of hats, and that's sometimes not helpful for the organisation, stops them growing, because the accountant on the board does the accounts, or the lawyer on the board. Sometimes they want you to, but you need to constantly sort of review what you do I think for most people it's a real privilege and it's a wonderful experience.
And Andrew Sons, how do you feel like juggling a professional life, working with PAC, with emerging artists? Do you sometimes feel there's a bit of a conflict, or do you think, oh look, I really want to get out of this now, or I want to keep going, or how long would you stay?
Some would say too long. Yeah, I'm stupid enough to have 5 children at home, so it's another good escape. It's also
your own emerging artists.
That's right, my own artists emerging there. For me, it's awesome to be involved in a creative organisation, and I'm not saying that my workplace isn't creative. Who doesn't love selling annuities and working on funds management? And that can be enjoyable in its own sense, but it's also wonderful to go and engage with artists in a community that creates stuff. It doesn't matter what we create across these different organisations, it's subject material that is actually interesting. It's interesting to your soul in some respects, which is another part of the tragedy of the funding story. But it's being able to get engaged in something, like Lee said, she knew what a dream was when she was 3 years old. We're not all that lucky. So if we've developed some skills that are going to be beneficial for these companies out there, then it's nice to be able to engage and actually deliver that as well, because we're immersed within these artists. And in a smaller organisation, and I haven't been involved in on a board of a larger arts organisation, but at least in a smaller organisation, you are really there at the ground level talking about, not necessarily talking about the operational issues, but the key issues that are barriers to the operations getting up and running and delivering on those artistic visions and stuff. And that's exciting and it's enjoyable, and it's enough to get out of bed for, to come and do it.
And at Lee Lewis, your company is renowned. I mean, your signature is doing new, edgy work, but you have also directed for a lot of the major companies in Australia. And there's a lot of criticism that sometimes the material is too safe. With our opera company, with Opera Australia, with the Australian Ballet, there's always Swan Lake and there's always Madame Butterfly, because it sells. Do you feel sometimes that there's board influence that is affecting our major companies in their repertoire?
I think there's been an aversion to risk in the last, or actually, maybe that's not aversion. It's actually just not enough clever hedging of risk within the companies, and company-wide understanding of which works you're taking the risk on and why. And I think that's a complex conversation to lead, but an exciting one. I don't think that's necessarily coming from the boards at all. I think there are big questions in the artistic community as we look at risk and what the nature of risk is, because our theatre, speaking very specifically in theatre, we're sitting in a space that's in between subsidised and commercial work. And that question about, is it too safe? Not when you're doing for commercial numbers. Not at all. Like, you look at the work that's on Broadway, we have a far more radical mainstream theatre here in Sydney than you would get in New York. The work that we see on the Sydney Theatre Company stage is far more experimental than you would ever see on Broadway. Maybe off Broadway, maybe off Broadway, but we're actually lucky. We've got audiences that go to works that are not conservative at all. They have opinions about them, yes, but they're still buying tickets to those and wanting those to be part of the conversation. So I think there's more of a challenge to the artistic community to push those boundaries. But I don't find the conservatism coming from the boards at all. In fact, often, and that's been my direct experience, is often there are board members who are going, "Really, you're going to do that? Oh, right, we're going to have a few disappointed people there. We should be doing things that are more pushy, don't you think?" And you kind of go, yeah, actually we should, but why? So why am I doing something that's actually a little bit more conservative in form? And making the argument for conservative work is actually part of the artistic process as well. What are we seeking to conserve? And when you're talking about playwriting specifically, sometimes conservative forms are necessary to put on stage to inspire new generations to explore those forms, as opposed to not ever be exposed to them. So those conversations are interesting. Again, that question of risk and conservation.
And Kath, what's your thoughts on what Australian audiences are being presented at by a lot of the major companies, where there is that criticism that sometimes it's a bit safe?
I'm your Reggie kind of a gal. You know, I like to have things flowing through the air. I like stories that no one else has explored before. So I would have to say, from a personal aesthetic point of view, there's a lot of safety going on, and to me, a lot of the work feels a little bit soulless. You know, I mean, I can admire the craft to it, but where's the guts of it? And you know, sure, you know, pop in a star, let's sell some tickets. You know, pop in someone who used to be on a film or write on a film, sell some tickets. But where is the urgency of the stories that are happening in Australian life? You're not seeing them necessarily on the main stages. You're seeing them at places like Griffin. You know, you are seeing them at places like Malthouse. You are seeing them in smaller works, in independent spaces, in larger festivals. Yes, some of the festivals are taking some risks. But those urgent stories and the new writers, in particular female writers, you're not getting a lot of the main stage companies taking the risk on them. And I think that's a pity. I can understand it from the environment point of view, but I'm a little bit like Lee. I mean, I don't know what goes on in those boardrooms. You know, sure, there are some conversations about sustainability, there are some financial conversations, but there's also, no, I can't speculate what goes on in their boardrooms. You know, but there's a large artistic conversation about how the artistic director's vision is supported, and what mechanisms go around that.
But you have a suspicion that there might be broad influence on the repertoire then, that they're going for the bottom line?
Well, they have an imperative, a financial imperative, to maintain this sustainability. But I agree, there are models that you can have as a board strategically to manage the risk within a season, and they're not necessarily doing that.
I can say right now, my risk appetite for the artistic program that gets put forward is a lot lower than it used to be now, and that's because of funding situations, and that's just. I hate to use the word realistic, but that's just unfortunately where we end up going. If you get your funding cut, you can't take the risks that would otherwise not necessarily, you know, guarantee an audience in there, and then you start to create a little bit more vanilla work.
How much of, you know, what did you lose in proportion to your budget, and what does that, how does that manifest then?
I'm really quite scared to say, but you know, half. Yeah, that's pretty devastating. So we were having a brief chat earlier on about, well, what does that mean for the future going forward for the organisation? You've got all sorts of options, none of which you really want to take, but you can start to use the space that you have more. For more commercial purposes, for example. You can start to change the artistic, direction of it, to engage other parties to come in or to exploit it in ways that are not necessarily what we'd say are in line with the company's goals. But you have to survive for a period of time until you can create those other revenue streams, and you're probably going to get onto philanthropy or something in a little while. But all those sorts of questions about how an arts organisation brings money in the door are really key right now, and it does regrettably impact the artistic risk that the board would like to take.
So if you say that you have to go a little more vanilla, will the audience recognise that? Will they respond to that? Will they stop coming? What's your...
They will definitely recognise that for an organisation like ours. Will they stop coming? I don't think so. Like, we've got a tremendous alumni and support base throughout people that have been with the company over the last 50 years. There's a great sort of movement throughout the universities to see that as a bit of a stepping stone as they emerge through into their professional development. But it's hard to generate money out of students. It's hard to generate money out of artists. We don't have Ian Narev there with a checkbook. So yeah, it's going to impact the artistic program significantly over the short to medium term, and hopefully we're able to survive a little bit longer.
Just getting off the track a little bit, you're hooked in. You've got a family. You're in you're in law. You're mixing with emerging artists. You're across it there. Why do you think this government is so savage on the arts?
Queensland.
There's so many ways to answer that. There's, 24-hour news cycles, you get grabs about how you spend your money and how that contributes to the fabric of the society. You don't just see it in government decisions on arts now, you see it in company decisions on everything they spend their money on. People are really reluctant to spend for the long term. They don't know how long they're going to be there, how their bonuses impact over 2 years. That's a big governance issue. So, if I can diverge slightly to say about the company I'm working for now, I think it's going the right way in terms of long-term incentives as opposed to short-term incentives. Why did the government do that? Because they probably think that they need to save money to spend on votes rather than invest in the culture of the society they govern, and that's shameful. Who cares if we save a few bucks if we don't actually have a heart?
And Sophie, you did say Queensland, which means numbers. But what's your view? Why?
I think Senator Brandis just made a decision, and no one
questioned
no one
it.
fought hard enough or was able to influence that outcome until it was too late. And then clearly they didn't think that the arts community or organisations were valuable enough to reverse that decision. So, it was reversed somewhat. Some of the money was put back. And I think there are plenty of leaders in the government who would personally be great supporters, who are great supporters of the arts, but clearly they're not able to influence the rest of the party to make that
Could I tap in there? I think they are great supporters of the arts, but they don't understand the arts cycle. It's all very well to say, and I love opera, right? So I'm not going to say that we should strip money out of opera, but I know that there's a lot of people that have a lot of study to do before they go to the, universities to do various study, and they pay all this money for their teachers, and then they go on. It's not just about supporting the Australian Opera, it's about supporting all the schools underneath that. Yeah. It's about supporting the development that works into that. And I don't think that has fully been appreciated with Brandis's initial cuts, let alone what's happened afterwards.
I think that's the part of the whole sector that has been, seriously impacted, and that's the future. That's the lifeblood of the arts sector. They're the young emerging artists that you want to give them the break now, and they're the ones who are going to be making decisions, I suppose, in the next couple of years about what they do. Do they get another job? Does this just fall into... I did hear a story that Ian Narev, I don't know if it's true, do you know that he was a theatre person in his earlier life?
Yeah, that.
So, maybe he made a decision. So, people make decisions, and maybe he left something that he loved.
And sorry to hog it, but can I just say the thing that really annoys me most about this is that, with all due respect, your Sydney theatre companies and your Australian operas and your ballets and all that sort of stuff, they can go to Lexus, they can go to CBA, they can get the corporate dollars.
And they do.
Then they do. It's the government.
Then they go and get another pot of money.
And then they go and get another pot of money from. Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's the thing that's most disappointing.
Can I pick up on Andrew's point on short-termism? Because I think that's a real challenge for our society, at government, at corporate, at indeed not-for-profit sector. There is a short-term focus, and I'm seeing it in all sorts of different directions. It's been wonderful to actually see some statements being made about we need to have a longer-term perspective. But
you mean not just in the arts, but more generally?
more generally, and I think that's a conversation that we've got to have a lot more of about that longer-term perspective. But when you're dealing with short electoral cycles, that is a real challenge, and when you're dealing with very short media cycles as well. But
Project thinking as opposed to longer term investment. And if you've only got the portfolio for 6 months, what can you possibly do? You've barely read through the list of all the companies that you're supposed to be across. I think that we've put unfair pressure on the people that are politicians to ask them to be across the different portfolios so quickly. In a way when, I see the arts as one of those things, one of those portfolios that they're using to get to another portfolio. I think, and the lack of understanding that they can have in that time is devastating on our end, but they're on to the next one,
And it is the grant, anyone that applies for grants for their work, like in the arts and science and medical research, you are just, your creativity or your scientific excellence is always sort of got an end point, because are you going to go to the next place? Do you have to leave the country? You know, and I mean that's why I think we've seen in the small to medium, perhaps more the larger, smaller companies in the arts, why philanthropy has had such success in terms of an income stream, because you can always find your people somewhere, a group of supporters. And I think Griffin has done really well in the last decade of really growing that area. And yes, they're not going to be getting the Lexuses, and the majors have great success in the corporate sponsorship area, but philanthropy for all of those companies has overtaken corporate sponsorship in terms of the money it brings in, and that's really only in the last decade.
Before I go more into philanthropy, I'd like to just go back to what we were talking about, Senator Brandis. And as I understand it, I think he was in Venice at the Venice Biennale with Rupert Meyer, who's the chair of the Australia Council, is the chair of the Australia Council, and Tony Grabowski, the CEO. And my understanding again was that they were all together, and he didn't mention that nearly half of that budget was going to disappear in the next day. Subsequently, with his move out, him being moved out of that portfolio, and Mitch Fifield going in, there was a little glimmer of hope among arts organisations that surely sense would prevail, and this is a grave mistake. It's not true. It's just a nightmare, and it will all be remedied with Malcolm Turnbull as well. It will all come back, and we'll all be very happy. But of course, none of that happened. And there has been criticism of the board of the Australia Council, the members, that which is quite a diverse group as it happens, have been silent. And I wonder, Phil, how would you interpret that should they or can they speak out, or are they they're obliged not to speak out?
I think it'd be very difficult on the board of the Australia Council to make any statements in that regard whatsoever. When you are on a board, the board meetings are held in confidence. For you to go out and criticise is it's a really difficult scenario. I certainly wouldn't expect that to happen.
You could, as an individual, go out in a blaze of glory, couldn't you?
Yes, if you
with a lot of supporters.
When do you break that?
Well,
I mean, if you're about to lose half your funding, do you think there's, I don't know, if
half the board could go?
If they said actually we're all going to resign if you do that.
But
maybe they just say
the
great.
senator's going to, the minister appoints the board. So they could just, I think that there's also probably an internal decision that, if we stick our heads too far out, then we can go. We'll be there for a term, and then we'll be replaced by somebody even more conservative than us, which, could in turn. There are some parts of the party that don't believe in any public sponsorship for the arts. So if you're a board member sitting there going, we need to defend what we have, then I can understand that there's a culture of not speaking up either, personally, or not going out with a blaze of glory. I imagine that'd be a very tough position to be in.
So Phil, can you see, looking at philanthropy, that one day there may not be any public arts funding, that we will have to rely on philanthropy and corporate sponsorship?
I'm not that bleak, but I think there will be an increased focus on philanthropy. And certainly that being the American model, we certainly saw conversations around that in our not-for-profit governance study, which we released last year, which looked at in a little more detail at the arts sector of an expectation around philanthropy. I'm hoping that won't be give, get or get off. I'm hoping it will remain as give, get, govern or get off, so that you still have that pure governance role as a director. But there was no doubt again from that piece of research was that there was a greater expectation on directors being able to use their networks, even if they weren't necessarily donating large amounts themselves. They were able to use their networks to be able to garner some greater level of philanthropy, and I suspect we'll see that. But I suspect we see that in other parts as well, not just in the arts. I certainly see it in in health-related issues as well. So I don't think it's just restricted to the arts. Maybe it's just a little more headline grabbing in the arts.
I'm wondering what the depth of philanthropy is, the sort of amounts that people give. I think famously Ros Packer on the National Art in the National Art Gallery has given a lot of money, and unfortunately a lot of it went to stolen Indian artefacts, which have since been given back to India, and that money was lost. But what is the level of money? I mean, and what is the expectation on some boards that an individual might donate?
Oh, I think that is as diverse as the sector is as diverse. The governance study number had a median of about $1,000, but I'm somewhat cautious on that because I think the people that completed that study perhaps were from slightly larger organisations, but that was the median that was reported. The dollar figure went from 100 to 50,000 from the directors of arts organisations, but I suspect it's going to be vastly different. Regional versus capital city, etc., etc.
Lee, what's your observation on that? And you, I noticed, are worried that public funding could disappear altogether.
I think within the next 20 years, I think we're going to be looking at being independent of government funding. Yeah. I think that the recent round of cuts are at the beginning of what will be much more extensive cuts, and not just to the small to medium, but into the majors as well. And I think that honestly, all of the companies are talking in that way, insofar as greater independence, so that the ideas of the companies aren't vulnerable to the vagaries of government. So, and I do think it's achievable in the scheme of 20 years. I think it takes a lot of restructuring and a lot of different thinking. And we're probably a good 150, 200 years off the depth of wealth that America has to start to be contributing, and a heritage of giving. But we're heading down that track. I look at, all of the board advice is always about small boards are good and that sort of stuff. But I look at friends that run, a friend that runs ART over in Boston and one up in Hartford, and they've got boards of 50.
Wow.
Different layers of boards, different projects within that, and they talk in different ways. But and 4 to 5 nights a week are spent with various fundraising activities, and you just whether that's personal dinners, whether that's larger events, whether that's in the company. So that's just the nature of the work when you don't have government support.
I don't believe that sport will lose its sponsorship in 20 years from the public purse, and I wonder why it is that there's been debate decade after decade about why there's a disproportionate amount of money goes into sports. We've got the Olympics on at the moment. Heaven knows the cost of sending the Olympic team and the training of those people to get them there, and I think they still don't have to pay HECS. I think things like that. There's such inequality. Why are the arts almost on their knees? Well, what is it that culturally in Australia still, in 2016, there's no political clout? Sophie, have you got a view on that?
It's quite amusing, really, isn't it? Because all those statistics about how many people visit cultural institutions surpasses the number of people apparently that go to sporting events. Plenty of people sit on their couch, but that's not quite participating the same way. I'm really not sure. I guess are we not a cohesive, collective, vocal enough group?
Ironically, we might be in the storytelling business, but we don't tell our story well. I think the arts community's got to look at, we've got to look at ourselves for why the cuts happen. I think Radis was advised by various people. He was lobbied by various people to make those particular. I think he thought he was doing the right thing. I think he thought he was doing a good thing.
I agree.
And I think that was because of who he was talking to, and they came from within the arts community.
To create the fund for excellence.
Because I think there were people strongly speaking to him that said the Australia Council is not working, and those voices came from within the arts community, and we've kind of gone, oh no, we didn't mean that. And I think we're now in the next phase of how do we pull together and actually speak as an industry across all of the different arts. How do we do that? We actually don't have a lot of good practice in doing that, and that's the next 10 years is really learning how to speak that way, so that when you do think about the artistic community, you think about it with the same kind of clout that farmers have, or the sports, or like, I think, and we don't speak as a group like that, and we should be able to.
Kath, what do you think of that?
I just made me picture, because I'm a bit of a nerd, when a politician makes an announcement about something to do with the arts, where they've gone out and they've been really positive, you know, about it, and I watched their social media feed afterwards, and always you'll get a string of people going, but what about hospitals, but what about education, but what about the homeless, but what about you know, everything else except the arts. And then you'll get a string of people going, elitist wankers, inner city latte Chardonnay drinkers, you know, who do they think they are? You also get a string of people going, well, if they're a good enough artist, they shouldn't need public subsidy. But then, you know, all these people go and see the arts. And they go and participate in it, and they see outdoor installations, and they go to galleries, and they listen to music. I mean, music is an art form of our generation, constantly listening to music. But do they see that as the arts?
Yes.
The arts, when it's put like that. Can we shift that? Can we talk about it better? And can we, let's face it, some people probably need to get off the high horse, the arts high horse, step down from the pony, and get amongst the people.
Look at Vivid.
Who
thought lights were that interesting?
That's
But
right.
wow, you couldn't get down Macquarie Street. It was so.
Certainly, as a journalist, the impact of the presence of arts in the public forum has shrunk immeasurably. I was the National Arts Reporter for many years for News and Current Affairs at the ABC. That position no longer exists. I used to have a fight daily to get art up there, and not on art shows. I did do art shows as well, but I always believed very passionately of putting art out there on a platform with sport, with finance, with crime, and to make a news of it. It was a battle every day, but the audience response was very good. The audience really liked that. But now, right across the media, the newspapers' arts pages have shrunk from maybe 3 or 4 pages to half of a page, and in the case of those little tabloid quality newspapers, half of a tabloid page. So it seems that the power is going in every which way, except for celebrity entertainment. You know, which Hollywood marriages broken up. And I just wonder, can any of that, can you see, how can that be turned around? What do you think?
No, I have no idea. I'm sorry. I guess, you know, we sort of get swept up in so many different things these days, and we follow what someone else tells us is popular, like Vivid. Now, I love Vivid, and I think that you know, they've done a fantastic job in making that popular. I also sort of take with you know, a lot of interest what Lee says about why aren't artists telling better stories. You know, we're filled with creative people, you know, marketing people, movie makers, you know, storytellers in every sense. Maybe we just need to work out the formula to make it sexy and promote it.
I think it is sexy. I think
it's very.
I think it's still just seen as elitist, and there's little bits of us. I mean, everyone goes to Sculpture by the Sea. Everyone goes to all those concerts.
The movies.
I think the stats, we know all those arguments that Kath was talking about, but I think maybe it is that we're not united enough, and that, you know, once that, you know, the Australia Council has a role in advocating for that, but they're suffering their own. You know, they're being pilloried as well. So maybe we've been a bit too complacent, and we need to come together and think of a better way to communicate that.
If you think about the last 50 years, what's been established in all of the arts across the whole country, we've built up an extraordinary network with government support to get there. And it's probably been a pretty competitive 50 years insofar as resources and buildings and all of that to get to the point where you know your institution isn't going to evaporate. But I think we're going into the next stage. The next 50 years is actually about extraordinary collaboration and the coming together of all of those organisations. And I think the more we resource share, I think, look, we can see the disappearance of a particular type of media, but at the same time we're communicating with our audiences much, much better. You know, the rise of social media and the companies means that we're actually talking directly to a lot of audience. We don't necessarily need that that print media the same way that we used to get to people. You know, and numbers are going up and up and up insofar as getting better at how we talk to people who are already interested and getting them to advocate for us. So that domino theory of social media is actually starting to work. And I think the willingness of companies to share those lists that used to be so carefully hoarded, you know, yeah, absolutely, I will send out to all the people, you know, our 25,000 people on our mailing list, absolutely I will. And because I want them to know about your work, because I think it's great work, and more great work makes more great work. And the better the audience experience, the less they stop going, oh well, I've seen one bad thing this year, so I'm not going to go to anything. You know, and which used to be a thing. But I think that the next 50 years is about extraordinary collaboration.
That's why the fast food joints all get next to each other.
Yeah,
That's exactly right.
Well, that thing of precinct,
You have one
and
bad
you can see it
hamburger,
happening
one
with
bad chicken.
Parramatta. You know, as Parramatta builds, so there will be more venues there, and then it becomes the second centre, and then people, as the transport company backwards and forwards gets better, so people are willing to go out and see. So you start. I think it's actually about bringing the city together and actually linking up the different centres that exist in the city.
Can I pick up on
Yes.
collaboration there, because that's been a key theme we've seen for the last few years growing in the broader not-for-profit sector. The collaboration is an absolute key. What was a little interesting was we delved into mergers and how many organisations were considering mergers. A lot more in the broader not-for-profit sector and a lot less in the arts sector. Now, I'm not sure if that tells us anything in particular, but it was a standout stat that arts organisations weren't looking at merging into anywhere near the same degree that non-arts organisations were in the NFB world.
And you think they should?
Oh, no, I don't make an observation on that at all. But what concerned me a little bit, they weren't even having the conversation around it. And I would have thought almost any board should be having a conversation of, is our purpose still going in the right way, and are we structured in the right way? And a merger might be part of that. A collaboration will certainly be part of that. Or indeed, when's the time for us to actually cease as an organisation altogether? And that's perhaps the greatest challenge.
Shall we sack ourselves?
Exactly right.
Not many people
Well,
do.
if you look at health, you know, a lot of this is historical, and because of our federal structure, you know, that every state has their own orchestra, every state has their own ballet, every state has their own heart research thing. Now, with, you know, state borders collapsing, and we communicate much more efficiently. A lot of those things, you know, even education systems, we all have different ones, and why do we? It's another conversation. But do we need, I don't know, do we need 7 different...
Don't you mention the Tasmanian Symphony Orchestra.
It
used to be the most...
should we just have good ones? Does every state need their own version? I don't know.
That question of uniqueness is key, I think, at a lot of boards in the arts at the moment. Uniqueness as to why we should be surviving in our own right. And the collaboration discussion is almost a threat to that, isn't it? Because in some way, well, almost a threat. In some ways, you want to keep that separation because you are unique. You have a unique audience. You have unique stakeholders in different, you know, parts of your world. But if you do collaborate, you can be bigger and stronger and have, you know, that differentiation from all that white noise of social media out there. You know, how many invitations to events do you get that you just go, next? We need to be differentiated, but we need to leverage our resources. So.
And Phil, that I guess we were chatting a bit earlier about this, that sort of an inflexibility, does that sometimes go back to because boards aren't refreshed enough, that there's not enough turnover of board members, or a chair might stick in for a few years too long?
Yeah, I think the whole area of board succession planning is again a great challenge. But I'm also mindful that, you know, if you're not a high-profile organisation, not everyone's queuing up to give you those hours per night, per week, per month that's required to properly govern an organisation. So I actually think it's a challenge. I think you've got to have the conversation around the board as to what is the appropriate makeup of the board for now and into the future. You've got to be able to have those difficult conversations with the chair, when it's time for the chair to go, and everyone knows that except for the chair themselves. And that's one of the great difficult conversations to have. But also to recognise that for each of us, we have a term when we're going to add value, and then perhaps it's time to bring someone else on, and hopefully you can do a little bit of work in the lead up to that time when you're stepping off as to someone with the appropriate skill sets that's going to come in and make a better contribution.
It's a really interesting point you raise, especially about the chair, and I'll sort of self-reflect for a second, because over the last couple of years I have, at least on more than one occasion per year, said to the rest of the board, guys, let's have a chat about the composition of the board. You know, who do we have on, you know, here? And by the way, do you think I should stay? You know, and it's not because I don't want to be involved. It's just that as you look around the room and you talk to the company themselves, you sort of say, am I adding enough value to you? And sometimes it's not enough for them to say yes, because maybe it's just that they can't find anyone else. But on the same stretch of the imagination, you have to stay, I guess, alert enough to know that if you are doing a good enough job or not. What is a good enough job for a board as well? So you've got to put those KPIs in there. You have to stay ahead of the game in terms of where the company's going, and that's a huge question. I don't think a lot of boards ask themselves hard enough.
And I think we're seeing more and more evaluation or self-evaluation of boards. It's still relatively early days in many, in particular smaller organisations, where they are putting their heart and soul into it. So they can also be challenging conversations. But I would like to think every board should be having a conversation at least once a year about how effective they are, how effective the meetings are. The new board that I'm now on, which is in a health-related area, we certainly have that conversation at the end of every meeting. Let's explore how well the meeting has gone, what could we be doing differently. The latest themes seem to be we need to focus more on strategy and less on operational issues. But I think if every board could have those real conversations, it would be a better thing.
But also I think there's a conversation around, is this the right board for this time?
Yeah, I agree.
You know, because, I mean, we are in a particular time at the moment, and the answer is our board the right time? You know.
I think if you have turnover of the key staff, you know, the key people, the artistic people, the GM, then that also has an impact on the board, because if, for example, I've seen boards, the landscape of boards change quite a lot when suddenly there's a big capital campaign and all the ones that are not too keen on being involved in that, suddenly they resign quite quickly. Or, you know, or they're actually, you know, even on the major companies where a lot of them are still appointed by the various state governments, they choose different sorts of people, or they're moved off.
Now I wonder, it'd be quite good to hear from the audience if anyone has any questions of any of our panellists. We could do that now. Do we have a microphone at the moment? Oh, we do. We have a wandering microphone. Wandering person. This woman up here.
Is it on? Oh,
Yeah.
now it is. Thank you. I'm from an organisation that has only just recently incorporated, and so we've been around for a few years, but just recently actually incorporated, and so we're going through all this kind of setting up the board stuff kind of now as we speak, which is very interesting and overwhelming at times. And originally kind of no one wanted to be on the board, and then all of a sudden we had too many people wanting to be on the board, and then we kind of had a bit of a situation where half the people wanting to be on the board were really invested and committed and keen to put in the work, but maybe some people are they want to be on the board, they just kind of don't necessarily want to do the work that's always involved. And I'm just wondering if you guys have any advice for how you kind of manage that and set high expectations. You know, we're from a small kind of community where things are, you know, small and personal and you know, all like, I don't know, anyway. And so it's kind of this weird thing of like, how do you set expectations high of your board, but not get people offside, I guess, as well.
The hard conversation.
Can I perhaps kick off? I think you need at the beginning to have a real conversation about what are the roles of individual directors and the board. So getting an understanding, given that you're incorporated, understanding of what the duties and responsibilities are, which, you know, they're not onerous, but people need to understand what they are, and that can sometimes give them a sufficient fright to make sure, well, if I'm not putting in the hard yards and making sure that we're not trading while insolvent, then there's potential challenges. So understanding what your duties and responsibilities are, but then understanding the broader purpose of the organisation and what your role as an individual director and a collective board can bring to achieving that purpose. Because it might be that those passionate people could be better off being used in a volunteer committee or other forms of assistance within the organisation rather than being on the actual board. I think you want to have people on the board that understand and can do those roles of governing the organisation.
And you have in fact produced documents of the how-to guides in a way, haven't you? And Mike, can you sort of reveal how people in the audience could obtain that?
So we produced about 3 years ago the Good Governance Principles for Not-for-Profit Organisations. I'm not trying to do a sell because they are freely downloadable off our website. What I think is really useful for them is that there's 10 different principles in there. You can pick one at a time, have a bit of a conversation about it at the board, and I found lots of organisations have done that. When we went out and consulted, which we did very broadly with the not-for-profit sector, we had in mind that we might come out with recommendations about what constitutes good governance. We heard loud and clear that that would be inappropriate, because what suits governance for a small arts organisation or a small healthcare charity is going to be vastly different from $1 billion charity. So what we went for in here are questions for consideration. So what are the sorts of questions you might like to ask each other about risk or board succession planning or whatever it might be? But yeah, freely downloadable off the website.
One for each member of the board, I think.
Can I have a crack at this? I think it really depends on what sort of organisation you're establishing and the community that you're looking to represent from a lot of different perspectives. I just stepped down as president of a musical society last week. Funnily enough, that was probably more hands-on than a board of an arts organisation. And the reason I mention that is because, you know, in that environment, if people were volunteering, I would similarly say, listen, let's get a delegated committee to the overall management committee, because you want people to be doing as much as you possibly can. In a different organisation, you want the right skill set. And one of the key things, I'm sure is in your guide there, is around a skills matrix as to who can contribute to the board and what sort of the purposes of the organisation are. And if you can really have a good think about that amongst the key people that are involved in the establishment there, what sort of people do we need? How are we going to be able to leverage the expertise? And it could be a bit of both. You know, what do we have versus what do we need?
And then you can, once you've got some sort of entity, you know, one of those directors can then have the responsibility of, you know, talking to the prospective new ones about actually this is the gig, this is what it really involves. I used to be sent out to meet people to say, you can come on this board, it's really great. We all give. You can give $50 or you can give 5,000. This is what we're working towards this year, because I was on the fundraising committee, and one particular person never turned up again. In fact, probably more than one, but I do remember a particular person who had a very large profile, a big runner.
Didn't have $10.
Terrified, absolutely terrified.
Can I just add something to that?
Yes.
I'm Jason from the GS, people will know me here.
Yeah.
One of the things that I would recommend is that you treat recruiting board members like you treat recruiting senior executives. You have roles and responsibilities, and they're laid out as part of this thing, because you're in a good position when you're recruiting a whole new board to say exactly the skill matrix, what are the sort of things you need from different people. Yeah. And once you go and talk to people like Sophie does, they're well aware straight away of what's required of them. So there's no surprises once they get in and realise that they're not actually up to what they're required for it. So treat it like any other recruitment exercise.
Yeah, and also there is something about the group. Is it a functional group? Does it work? You know, sometimes you can have 10 fabulous people, but they don't work very well as an entity, you know, so that is when you get a bit bigger.
Any more questions?
Looking forward to it.
There we go.
I would like to go back a little bit about the cooperation between the various organizations, because I feel that at the moment is the biggest risk we're facing. It's the divide between the haves and the have-nots. And is there any advice how we can minimize that divide and conquer, which seems to be happening a lot at the moment?
So you were talking about the major performing arts companies that have got the lion's share of the funding, is that what you mean? And the small ones and regional ones
Yes,
that don't?
yeah.
Lee?
We've started to have those conversations about resource sharing, about artist support, and I think they've been very positive conversations. Anyone that, look, I think there's a lot of good that's actually come out of being backed into a corner like this, and I think we're going to see, the interesting thing is what we're seeing is the fruits of the 10 to 15 years of investment for the Australia Council in the idea of strategic thinking in small to medium. The way that they've been pushing over that period of time for people working in the small to medium and as individual artists to be able to articulate both your practice but your strategy as well, means that in talking to government and in talking to each other, we're able to talk in terms that are much longer than project funding. And I think that conversation is healthy, and I think we will start to put together real runs on the board that are to do with collaborative process. I'm actually quite hopeful in the midst of a lot of difficult conversations, because the arts community has been brought together in a way that we haven't been made to be in a long time. So
I'm not as hopeful as you.
I was going to ask you next, yes.
We're being shut out of conversations that you're talking about because we don't make text-based theatre, quote unquote. Not from you, but from the bigger wonderment that is, STC. So, you find there is a haves and have-nots, and some people are making slices and decisions on very arbitrary and strange reasons. Whereas I think about us as an arts community. I think about Legs as a place that bridges theatre and dance, circus, and we play with all those fields. Circus Oz, strangely enough, have been the people that have reached out to us and said, can we do anything to help? The own community in Sydney can be siloed, and it can exist within. When we were at Lilyfield, geez, whoa, it's a long way away from the wharf. And I think that you need to also, if you're asking for those principles above you, you need to abide by those principles for the independents that are looking for space or looking for assistance or looking for mentorship. And you need to be part of that ecology. It can be frustrating that the majors aren't necessarily, reaching down to help you out, but also you've got to just pick yourself up by your bootstraps and make it happen.
I think that I guess we've sort of expressed a little bit of unfortunate,
have-nots.
Yeah, today.
Yeah.
But by the same token, I think we should recognise that the haves have reached out after all this stuff has happened and says we support the have-nots, right? Now, is that enough? Probably not. What we need to do is probably tap into that collaboration idea. Make sure that, the claim that I made earlier on tonight is that organisations like Legs or Pact or Griffin, we feed into these major organisations, and strategically our challenge is to actually directly connect into that. So if we have particular companies that are our targets that we say you can't survive without us, we need to go and actually illustrate why that is the case and how we can have these strategic relationships on a longer term basis so that they feed us, we feed them, and it's mutually beneficial. And that desperately requires that collaboration immediately, because without that, the smaller companies will fall off within the next few years and it's too late.
They're already falling off.
They're already falling off.
And Platform Youth Theatre's already closed. There'll be several others over the next year. I mean, there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of positions made redundant in the next 12 months.
Yeah.
That's a big figure. But across lots of arts companies.
Well, a lot of it'll be interesting to the small to medium sector primarily, and the visual arts, theatre, literature, some jobs will become part-time, so you won't lose the position altogether, but you'll lose the hours that are equivalent to full-time roles.
And there's no campaign as such. There was the beginnings of one for a while, but it just seems pretty silent.
Yeah, I think people become very, I mean, you know, when you see Malcolm Turnbull's response on Q&A to Katie Noonan, and he just didn't even register. He was just like, this is a nothing issue to me. Basically, I've never really heard anything that people are worried about. And it's hard to keep momentum in a campaign where you're being loud, you're doing all these things, and you're just not having the traction. We saw the Liberal government not bring a policy to the election, you know.
And yet the Prime Minister is someone who has been a great, you know, a consumer of arts and both visual and performing arts, and has, you know,
he's a giver. He's a philanthropist. His family is philanthropic towards these organisations.
So is it totally political that he has few or no allies?
God, it's. I mean, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. You know, I think that's also the balance that he's making about several of his policies, about the hard right of the party, who also are the ones that want to end public subsidy to the arts, and then, you know, you've got some arts lovers here, and you get somewhere in the middle.
Do we need a Pauline Hanson of the arts to run for the Senate, like we had the arts party?
Was that Rose
By the
Wood?
way, hands up, or if you care to, who voted in any way at all for the arts party? Yeah, most, and I did too in a way. I thought myself that if the arts community had put up a single candidate and ran them hard for the Senate, rather than lots of little, you know, campaigns here and there that didn't take traction. But I'm only half joking, is that there needs to be some sort of rallying point, I think, politically, because it seems the arts are just not registering any
you're right. I think it's not that complicated. I think everyone's waiting for someone else to do it, and there hasn't been that person. And if you look at other sectors, there's something called an industry group or a peak body that does it, and maybe ours just isn't as loud at the moment.
They have peak bodies, they have been talking, but again, it's that thing of coming up with a consistent message across all of the arts, to actually articulate one sentence that we all agree on.
That's very hard.
Again,
I know.
that practice. I think we haven't had the practice at doing that, and I think we will get better at that. And I think when you talked about, you know, the beginnings of campaign, it was just a room of people going, oh, we should do something. Can you print? Oh, I've got like Avant-Garde said that they would help with this. Someone else said, oh, I've got there's a company that I used to work for that would do the graphic design for free. So it was a lot of what can we do for free because we don't have money to do this. Who can do it in their spare time? As everybody was, you know, doing it at like, you know, between 10 p.m. and 6 in the morning, all the flurries of emails going backwards and forwards. And the real gain out of that was a network of people that very quickly could put together something that may not have had an impact on government, but had an impact on going, wow, okay, we've got to get better at this. Again, formulating practice in doing that. And that question of an arts party, so looking back over what happened, okay, the next phase of that, because we're going to be in another election sometime soon, I would think. So again, what do we do then, and how do we build on that rather than keep trying to fight different fights?
It had a great impact on the opposition's arts policy.
It did. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Maybe it's all our responsibilities to do that, because really governments respond to the things that communities talk about and scream about and make a lot of noise about. So perhaps that showed that we were all a bit complacent and thought it would get managed.
And complacence is the short way to extermination.
To die, it is. That's right. That's right.
Any more questions?
Can I just ask a question just on complacency? I think I should disclose that I'm professor. So there's a person who's own, I think the AICD released some research over last year that a lot of boards actually told their artistic directors in both directions that they wanted to speak out. And I suppose on the complacency question, is it complacency or is there that risk aversion at the board level as well that did stymie the ability to really, that really stymie that ability to lobby? And I chair 2 arts boards and both took different approaches to how we dealt with that situation.
So the question being,
So is it complacency or is it risk aversion on the parts of boards as well, who I think the AICD
Maybe it's the
research
same thing.
indicated that when the announcements came out, a lot of boards actually thought that there would be repercussions if they did speak out. So therefore they chose to not
But
speak
look where it
out.
got us. I was part of some of those conversations, and I think that's right. But the same applies to most other sectors too that are heavily government subsidised, and health and science, and we can see other examples of them when they actually say, or education, we're not going to accept that outcome, and we're going to advocate in whatever form that takes. Perhaps that would have been a better alternative.
People are worried about being punished.
They are.
For
I
speaking
totally
out, particularly when Brandon's
understand
been
why.
the minister.
Losing their jobs or losing their funding. But most of those things ended up happening. So
certainly as a journalist, I always found one of the great frustrations reporting the arts always used to be that arts practitioners didn't want to say anything provocative because they were worried about their funding. But now the funding's gone, hey.
It's all on.
I should go back to reporting now.
I think
It's hard to remember to be a leader.
Yeah.
It's actually, if there's a question of leadership crisis in the country, I think is reflected in the arts. It's hard to remember to speak out and risk losing what you have. And that actually that's the job sometimes. It's hard to, and when you haven't necessarily been in that situation of feeling direct threat, it's hard to know how you would react in that circumstance. I think a lot of individuals in the arts and in organisations learned a lot last year about what worked and what didn't. And I think that will go forward in both good and bad ways. That sounds like I'm hedging everything there, isn't it?
Well,
but
the squeaky
it's,
wheel, at the squeaky wheel.
And look, I think
staying silent doesn't work.
No, but who speaks and what do you say and when do you say it and in what format do you say it to be effective? I think there was a lot of timidity last year. Whether it would have been any different, we will had people spoken differently, we won't know. But I think there's a lack of real leadership in the arts community, with people in prominent positions willing to go out for the industry and speak to government.
I think as well there was a bit of paralysis too around fear, but also what's the best strategy? Do we, get in our trucks and bolt down to Canberra? Do you do public campaign? Do you do all of that? We're actually trying to put on a show tonight, and so then it goes to the heart of everyone just kind of hopes someone will speak out.
Bob Brown was one of the speakers at the Byron Bay Writers Fest, and he's a national treasure, that man. And in spite of everything, he is the eternal. He's an optimist. He wrote a book called that, I think, The Optimist. But what he was talking about was, he said, 90% of Australians have just voted for the biggest coal mine ever, which in Queensland, inadvertently by voting for both the parties. And he's got this plan. If this coal mine goes ahead, is that he and other, as he said, older, greyer Australians with a bit of money from Hobart are getting a bus, and they're going to drive up to Queensland and stand and get the bus, and they're all going to be there in front of the the bulldozers again. And I guess that gets me onto that question of age. And where are the young people? Where are the angry young agitators? Where are the disaffected young artists out there, the emerging artists? Why are they silent?
Huge hex debts. Yeah, I've just finished paying off mine. And you go, the kind of bills that people have to rack up now to get an education that allows you to think
keep
outside
a roof
of
over your head.
Yeah. I think that's a big part of it.
So it's economic.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
My name is Andrew. I come from this part of Australia that most of the arts community have never heard of. It's called Parramatta. And out that way, we've never received much funding from the Australia Council. I've worked with organisations that have never had a chance of getting funding from the Australia Council. And look, quite frankly, we don't suffer one little bit from arts funding. If the Australia Council were to disappear tomorrow our organisation, my organisations, would probably thrive in the new environment, because we are speaking the language of how does the arts cultivate the economy? How do we create jobs? Those are the sorts of questions we're trying to answer from our little spot in Parramatta, where we receive no government funding whatsoever.
Which organisation?
I run a couple of different organisations. I have a music and entertainment company personally, but I also work with a disability filmmaking initiative. Yeah. We give the intellectually disabled the opportunity to write, produce, star in their own films, and so on. And we do that completely without any government funding whatsoever. We don't even get disability funding for that. We no matter how much we ask for it, we always seem to get turned down for various petty reasons, from whether it's the Australia Council, Accessible Arts, or whatever it is. So we persevere. And we do the work anyway, and we get things done, and we achieve outcomes. These are the sorts of art projects that we don't consider as part of the arts community, but it is arts work, and it is community work nevertheless.
You have a board?
Yes, we do, absolutely. And we run it on the same principles as a corporation or as a fundraising organisation. So I have to ask, what is a win for the sector where, the Australia Council and the arts funding situation has never been good? It has, for the last 20 years, 30 years, certainly my lifetime, it's never been particularly equitable. We receive, 1% of Australia Council funding to the 2.2 million people in Western Sydney. We receive, probably even more ridiculously, about 5.5% of New South Wales government funding outside of Sydney. So 94.5% of all arts funding is within the 10-kilometre radius of the Sydney CBD. So I have to ask, what is a win? If people outside of the cities, the concentrated cities, who are not necessarily part of the latte sipping, artiste community, if we don't feel part of this community, before, what do we consider a win for our sector? When you go to government and you say, we want to restore funding to the Australia Council, or we want to restore funding to theatre groups in Redfern, or these little inner city areas, I don't see any solutions for Western Sydney. I don't see any solutions for regional New South Wales coming out of the leadership in the arts community. And I've got to say, if we have to go to local councils, or if we have to go to philanthropy and talk about redirecting funding and fighting for funding from our city counterparts, even if that means dismantling the Australia Council, I don't know why that would necessarily be a bad thing. Where do you, as a panel, see, what do you consider a win for the broader arts community, the same arts community that employs more than both mining and farming combined?
Okay, well look, I'll kick off with that, because in fact I was out in Parramatta when Brandis was there campaigning before the last election, and in fact promising more money for the Western regions. But I personally think it's a flawed argument to say it's geographic, that arts funding is geographic. Like, for example, when I travel and I go to a major city, the major theatres just happen to be geographically based there. I mean, the Opera House is there, the major theatre companies, and people come from all over the country and all over the world to geographically visit those theatres. It's not just that the people, that they're physically placed out in the Western area. That's one thing, I think. So I think it's slightly misleading to say that 95% of the funding goes into the middle of Sydney, because that just happens to be where a lot of the major companies are sited, and where the big theatres are, and the Opera House, etc., and where people come to. So, but I'll throw that open, because I just hear that argument a lot, and I've also been out to the theatre in Parramatta when it's often empty, or people haven't turned up to the ones that are out there. So I think it's but I also agree that there's not enough funding. But I'm just saying, I think it's a weird thing to say that it's all stuck in the middle of the CBD. I don't think so.
I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to stop it there, because we've gone over time.
Okay.
So sorry to cut off a really engaging. I mean, we can probably do 30 seconds, and then we'll have to call it a night.
Anybody want to buy in quickly on that one? Well,
I was just going to say, I think you've had, I think, when it comes to Parramatta, there's been a number of wins. The Packer is fantastic, straight to Western Sydney identified. The new money that went into the arts, not in this last trench, but the trench before, was absolutely nailed at Western Sydney. So I think there's 2 wins there that you can celebrate.
And I think we might have to leave it
We
there.
have to,
Yes. So, on that note, look, thank you very much for attending, everyone. Well, we've had about 60 people here in the room tonight, but very pleased to report we've had 230 people watching online. Tonight's our first night streaming on Facebook, so hello out there to the rest of the universe. Thank you very much, panel, for a really engaging conversation. And before we wrap up and thank the panel, 2 plugs for you. Our next SAMAG seminar will be happening on the 29th of August, and it is around composing cities. So it's a seminar on public art, so we'd love to see you there then. The Australia Council is doing renovations at the moment, which is why we'll be moving around different venues for the next couple of months. So keep your eyes on the website to see where we will be, because at this point it is a mystery. And the second point is we'd really like to get your feedback on tonight's seminar and also our seminars generally. We're about to plan our 2017 seminars, so really keen to hear from you guys about what you'd like to see in the program for next year. We'll be sending around an evaluation about the seminar tonight, so we'd really appreciate you filling that out. And before you head off, please join me in thanking our wonderful panel.